in New York City, and a member of the editorial board Socialist Alternative newspaper, the US section of the ISA. Hello, Eljeer, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Eljeer, the last months, the US is the epicenter of the pandemic. My first question would be, why in the richest country in the world superpower, COVID-19 has infected so many people and so many people have died?
I think it's rooted in the fact that we are the capitalists of the capitalists. The mindset of profit reigns supreme. And so when the pandemic hit the shores of the United States, you have an administration, the Trump administration, that denied the pandemic, that denied the reality of the virus. You have to keep in mind that this is an administration that denies that there's a climate crisis that exists. Mike Pence, the vice president of the United States, when he was governor of Indiana, he uh, literally sat on his hands in the face of the HIV/AIDS crisis in that state. Um, and so the information that many of us have seen and heard of is that the United States had intelligence going back to January, even some reports saying since October of 2019, that the pandemic will be hitting the shores of the United States. So this is rooted in incompetency. It's rooted in pure greed and denial, and absolutely criminal neglect for the health and the lives of the American working class, poor, and most oppressed.
Mhm. What was the conditions of the health system when the pandemic reached the US?
Um, we first of all, we don't have a national health system from the standpoint of it being free and public. We have privatized healthcare. Obamacare, which was signed into passage many years ago, still leaves 30 million people uninsured without any healthcare coverage at all. And so when the pandemic hit the shores of the United States, we have faced austerity when it comes to healthcare. So you have a privatized healthcare system on one side, and then part of that austerity attacks on healthcare over the past 40 years, right? So in the state where I'm born and raised, New York State and New York City, we've lost 21 hospitals, beginning since 2003. In the rural areas of this country, since 2005, we've lost 170 hospitals. Um, Basically, the idea that if these hospitals are not profitable, then we need to close them down. We need to shut them down. That is the mindset of the US ruling elite. So when the pandemic hit, it hit a system that was already ailing. It was already sick, actually. And so the pandemic just pushed us over the edge. And so there are a number of communities in the United States that are facing this pandemic without the proper resources, without the proper infrastructure to deal with it, meaning the lack of ventilators, the lack of beds, the lack of staff, the lack of resources to really confront COVID-19.
But as you say, also the privatized system meant that not everybody had the right to go in a hospital when they got sick. So what do they do, these people? How do they deal with the situation?
Many would stay home. Many would stay home and attempt to ride out the symptoms of COVID-19. And certainly in the early days of the pandemic, certainly here in New York City, the public hospital system was just overrun with so many people in heavily dense populated areas of the city go to the hospital. So many people would just try to stay home, try to ride it out, try to ride out the symptoms, and just hope for the best. Any new cases that we do see now will be people that were home that were scared to go to the emergency room, and also the fear. And this is the sickness of American healthcare, is the fact that you could be seen by a doctor, but at the end of the day, you will get a bill that you know that you cannot pay for in the thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars. Um, if you're lucky to have health care and to be treated for COVID-19, it will cost you, um, you know, $10,000. If you don't have any health care at all, it will cost you over $30,000 to be treated for COVID-19.
How possible is this to be paid? I mean, these amounts are crazy.
Yes, in normal circumstances, most people will go bankrupt. Bankruptcy in terms of healthcare is the seventh leading cause of bankruptcy. The lack of healthcare is also a leading cause as well of death. So, this COVID-19, this pandemic has been a deadly cocktail for the American working class, and particularly the American poor and the American most oppressed, who lack resources on a daily basis anyway, under normal circumstances.
Mhm. What did you see that could have happened? I mean, in the conditions that the pandemic started, how could it be more effective and more contained?
I think the first order of business is the fact of the character of the Trump administration and the character of American capitalism. We've seen the total destruction of infrastructure. We've seen the conditions on farms, of food production. We've seen the level of denial of the climate crisis that also is added to this process. The unleashing of the different microorganisms, the type of diseases that are emerging now, pandemics that are emerging now, and will emerge in the future. And so, when you have a government and you have a system that denies even the most basic necessities um, under normal circumstances, when a crisis like this hits, it exacerbates the contradictions in the society. So, what could have been done is the fact that, one, recognizing the crisis, right?
Mhm.
Having a national plan, which we don't still have a national plan. We have this kind of states' rights approach that states kind of do whatever you want to do. And then on top of that, we don't have a national healthcare system. Like, if we had Medicare for all, it would at least alleviate the stress and strain of people, being taken care of with COVID-19. They will not have the burden of paying such an exorbitant amount of money for their health care. But even that's not enough, Medicare for all. You would have to nationalize the pharmaceutical corporations, the insurance corporations, the research that goes into COVID-19 and pandemics, right? That would give the public the full understanding of what this virus is, and educate people, not arrest them if they don't have a mask or gloves, but give education and provide answers to their questions. If we had that in place and an early lockdown, I think that the 90,000 plus deaths that we're seeing in the United States would not be the reality that we're facing with today on May 20th, 2020.
Mhm. So finally, when the Trump administration decided to accept what is happening, what was the measures that they took, and especially compared with the working class people and the lowest, the poorest people, what was the measures that the Trump administration take?
Well, in the early stages, once he begrudgingly, he listened to the scientists, and you have to keep in mind the character of Trump as an individual, but also as an administration. He goes by the seat of his pants. He doesn't listen to the briefings, the early morning briefings that he has 2 or 3 times a week. He just goes off the top of his head. He goes from crisis to crisis. Um, and so you're not dealing with your normal bourgeois American politician. He's not Obama. He's not Clinton. And in fact, Obama, who was president at the time of the events of SARS. And so you're not talking about a regular, normal bourgeois politician. And so once he listened to the scientists, there were lockdowns, there were certain guidelines that were in place. Mind you, that just recently he went to a food production factory, and everyone is wearing masks and gloves except for Trump, right? And
But
so that sends a mixed message to people that in fact, I'm different than you, that I'm fine, and it doesn't take the virus in a pandemic serious. And so he is rushing to get the economy up and running again. They all are, right? But there are contradictions within that, right? There's the health and safety aspect, and like I said, there's no national plan. So that would mean national testing, social distancing, and then the anxiety of working people to get back to some level of normalcy in the sense of their wages and their benefits to take care of their family while we are living through what is emerging to be a new Great Depression in American society.
well, in many countries, they gave stimulus packages, they gave money to the workers. What was the situation in the US?
Well, as you know, the United States is a very special place because we really don't have a social safety net. And so when working people lose their jobs, in some ways, or around healthcare, they have to find a way to pay those bills. They're out of pocket, borrow, they go into personal debt, credit card debt. And so the early stimulus packages that were proposed and enacted were really corporate welfare to the major corporations. The even the money that was allotted, even the money that was allotted for small businesses have not reached small businesses in the United States. And so, in one of the packages, the 2.2 trillion, the largest in U.S. history, $1,200 was allocated for ordinary working people. Most of that, if not all of that, is gone. Many people use that to maybe pay a bill or to just buy food for themselves and their children. And so, basically, yes, there's unemployment benefits, although we have over 30 million people who have filed for unemployment benefits. That is kind of still waiting. And so we have not seen any bailout for ordinary working people before. And we're already seeing actually many workers being laid off, being what they call furloughed. This is a dire situation. It's a dire situation.
But now, as you said, even though the infected and the death numbers are not dramatically low, they're trying to open the economy. And if I'm not mistaken, many billionaires, they are demanding that. What do you think about that?
It's the logic, right, of capitalism. It's about maximizing profits for a small, tiny elite. I mean, here in the United States, we have 8 people that have more wealth than the bottom half of the U.S. population. We know before this pandemic hit the United States that the questions of poverty and inequality was unseen and unheard of in modern U.S. and global history. The amount of wealth that was accumulating at the top. And so when we think of Jeff Bezos as an example, Amazon is doing quite well during this period. While they have a number of their employees who have contracted and who have tested positive for COVID-19 and who have died from COVID-19, while they attack Amazon workers in the warehouses who are trying to organize to fight for their democratic rights and fight for their democratic rights on the shop floor to have a union. And so you have a person by the name of Jeff Bezos who is about to become a trillionaire, the first one in modern human history. And so this leads us to the moment where the same question that Bernie Sanders raised during the presidential primaries of the Democratic Party was, should billionaires exist? We say they should not exist. And that wealth, that power that they have in their hands are literally dictating how we live on a daily basis, but even um, more scandalous is the fact that if they have it their way, we will be dying on the shop floor. We will be dying at the workplace because of the lack of of protective equipment, because of the lack of resources, the lack of benefits, and they're feeding off the anxiety that ordinary working people have about trying to survive the economic depression, but also the pandemic.
Mhm. What was the reaction of the workers to this? I mean, in the past, we had a lot of strikes, especially in Amazon that you mentioned. It was an amazing and very inspiring movement. So, what is happening now in this level in the US?
Well, I think we have two processes taking place. On one side, you have many people will watch the news, they'll see the right wing, white nationalists outside of the various states' capitals demanding for the economy to reopen immediately, right? And then on the other side, we've seen workers like Amazon, like the service industry, the nurses, um, playing a very powerful role in social distancing protests to talk about the crisis in the hospitals, to talk about the crisis, the lack of resources and equipment. That has been a powerful indication of what we think is the music of the present and the future. And that is social movement, social struggle by ordinary working people and the poor to fight, to push back against not just the Trump administration, but push back against big business and their thirst for profits, and also push back against the right wing elements that Trump is inflaming in this situation, right? And so we think that this is going to be a continuing process that we see. But the key question is for that movement to continue, we have to be organized. We have to have leadership, and we have to be able to have an alternative political program that talks about healthcare, education, jobs, safety, building infrastructure that benefit the working class and the poor and the most oppressed. And that's the only way we're going to defeat the agenda of Wall Street.
Mhm. Do you see also, you mentioned that the workers that are now demonstrating and showing the way forward as a matter of demanding the protective gear and everything, that they could be able to stop this movement that is developing from people and protesting to actually open the economy. That as we see in the news, it's mainly mobilized by the far right, and the demands are ridiculous. Like one banner was saying, "We want to go to the hairdresser." Um, so, what is the, to be serious now? I mean, what is the situation with this movement and the rise of the far right in the U.S. and how do you fight against it?
Well, it's flowing from the fact that many communities have faced or have lived through over 40 years of neoliberal capitalism, and many working people, particularly those on the far right. Now there are forces that you cannot discuss with and negotiate with. Particularly, I'm thinking about the racists, those who practice xenophobia, anti-immigrant racism. There are no conversations that you can have, but there are people within that you can discuss with and explain how do we get to this crisis. That this is not to blame Black people, or LGBTQIA people, or to blame immigrants, but this falls on the shoulders of Wall Street, the rich, the super rich, the institutions of capitalism, and that what the far right is doing and what Trump has done, he has emboldened them to come out of the shadows where many years ago they would have been on the fringes of society. Now they've been asked to come out. And so um, certainly the trivial, I want to go to a barbershop, go to a hairdresser, okay. But when you see them with guns at the state capitol, it's something different. And so it needs an organized response by ordinary working people, the poor and the most oppressed, through coalition, through protests, certainly, through organizing, but even more important, to provide answers to their questions and to provide a fighting program that counters this argument of blaming Black folks or LGBTQ people and so forth and so on. And so that rests on racism, that rests on xenophobia, that rests on homophobia. And so our movement has to inspire a deeper vision of the world and what we can produce, and put the blame where it really sits. It sits at Wall Street. It sits with the Jeff Bezos and the Bill Gates of the world. And frankly, our movement has not done a good enough job to talk to those people who have anxiety, who are fearful of the present and the future. And so because if we don't do that, then we're going to see more and more people like what we're seeing in Michigan or Wisconsin. They're going to go to the right. They're going to go to the far right. And we have to find a pathway to talk to working people who are feeling uncertainty. This is not a new phenomenon. This is we've seen this throughout human history. And in the United States, the most recent history was during the last economic crisis of 08, 09, and the rise of the Tea Party. Mm-hmm. There was a moment in time where people were asking questions: why is Wall Street being bailed out and not Main Street, not ordinary working people? And who provided answers for them was not the left, which was very weak at that time, but in fact, it was the billionaire class. It was the billionaire class through their institutions that were providing answers for people, right? By saying it's these African, Black workers, it's the unions, it's LGBTQAI people getting their rights to marriage. And so if we don't provide answers, they will go to the right. They will find their answers and even find other ideas, even more dangerous ideas that we have to push back against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the last few years, and I think the basis of Trump administration was exactly this kind of people. Now, with the changes in the political situation in the US, we have to be ready to answer back and to stop the rise of the far right. And I want to ask you also, you mentioned about the previous crisis. Other than the racism that in the Tea Party, it also gave rise to historic movements, and the Occupy movement that inspired people all over the world. Even in Cyprus, we did have a small Occupy moment. Yeah. But the last few, but last few years, this movement found its political voice with Bernie Sanders from the Democrats. Tell us a little bit about him and his program and the movement that gathered around him.
I think Bernie represented, particularly in 2016, he represented what I like to call, he put his finger on the pulse of the American working class, right? He answered some of the key questions. In fact, Bernie, in this presidential race, went to places that is quote unquote Trump country, Trump land. He went to Appalachia. He went into the deep areas of Pennsylvania, and he can talk to Trump supporters. And so Bernie had a very powerful message. He talked about the billionaire class, right? His slogan for this campaign was "Not me, us." And so Bernie really highlighted the possibilities of what could be achieved in American society if we took a very conscious and intentional way, providing the most basic necessities for working people. Certainly, he described himself as a democratic socialist. That was very important, although I think Occupy Wall Street helped to defang socialism, right? Because it was talking about the 99% against the 1%, the majority against the minority. And for Marxists, that has always been the question, right? The two distinct classes in society with two distinct interests in society. And so, but Bernie helped to popularize that along with Occupy Wall Street and all the social movements after that. And so Bernie's model of democratic socialism, we would have disagreed with. It's more of a Scandinavian kind of post-World War II Keynesianism, where the state is providing resources, providing a social safety net, but capitalism still exists. The capitalist class still, rules society, but it provides, some of the most basic necessities for people, like housing and education, healthcare, roads, parks, things of that nature. So I think what has emerged with Bernie, that Bernie decided to end his campaign, and it disheartened so many people. It was a body blow to people that believed that, yes, he was running inside the Democratic Party, to which we disagreed with, actually, because the Democratic Party is a corporate party. It's a party that would not allow that type of program and that analysis and that approach to be the dominant feature of the party. And so they did everything they could through the corporate media, through their various institutions and their leaders to stop the Sanders campaign. And tragically, Sanders allowed it to happen because he believes, actually, that you can reform the Democratic Party. That even the people that he's railing against, the billionaires, would allow, particularly in this moment, this historical moment, allow resources to be distributed to working people on terms that are not based on the system itself, but based on terms of the state of the working class and poor. We're talking about neoliberalism here, that is looking to reverse what they gave up for 25 years after World War II. So Bernie was underneath this false illusion that his campaign could, in fact, take the Democratic Party over. And what we've seen, Bernie has kind of fallen in line with the Democratic Party leadership. He is falling in line to defend Joe Biden, who's going to be a very weak uh, 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 candidate against Donald Trump. But it has left a lot of people really, I think, politically demoralized. But the most important thing, if anything, he has unleashed a sense of people organizing and fighting back. We have to remember that 2019 was a year of social struggle around the world, right? And I think that spirit will continue on. It may take some time. People are still dealing with the shock and awe of what is happening with the pandemic and the economic crisis. But there will be struggle that will emerge. People will organize. And I think they will take inspiration from Bernie, but they'll say, we're going to take the baton away from Bernie and we're going to run with the baton, and we're going to raise ideas about what is genuine socialism, what is genuine workers' democracy, what does it mean to have um, healthcare as a right, what does it mean to have public education, because all those things literally are being attacked as we speak in a number of cities and states around budgets. So Bernie is a catalyst on one side, but also he's played a regressive role as well. And as we know, as Marxists, multiple things can be true at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So we have a comment from one of our viewers that is connected actually with what you already said, maybe covered a little bit. He's asking if the universal healthcare plane of Sanders is a sustainable plane, and how the socialist movement will claim the right to health and apply it. So would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I think one of the key things, and I think healthcare is going to be the next battleground. Here in New York State, in the city where I live, they have designs already to cut Medicaid, Medicare. And this will be devastating for people. We have to think about COVID-19 is not just the immediate sickness, but it's the after effects of COVID-19, the effects on other body organs that can lead to heart disease. And I haven't even talked about people with pre-existing conditions who have COVID-19 and the conditions they will have after if they're able to survive COVID-19. So the healthcare front is going to be a crucial battleground to make sure we have those resources. And I think that the demand for Medicare for all will increase. It's not going to decrease. I think the popularity of it will increase. You have nurses unions that are fighting on this front around PPE, protective equipment and gear. They will be raising. I think there'll be new union organizing around this idea. The way that we can win it, to be clear, and this goes for anything that we've won in the United States or even around the world, is the power of the working class, of them being organized, of fighting spirit, using tactics that is confrontational, having an independent movement that's not tied to both big to the Democrats or the Republicans, that speaks in a language that can be universally understood to ordinary working people. Healthcare, I think, is going to be the next key battleground. And, as a healthcare worker, I think this is where the demand for not just Medicare for all, but to nationalize healthcare, nationalize the pharmaceutical corporations, nationalize research, nationalize how we produce equipment. Because one of the key questions that was missing in the United States is the fact that you had all these factories idle. You had these major corporations with factories that was producing cars, but could have been repurposed to produce masks and gloves that you need. So we were literally we're living in a society where they're rationing the most basic resources, like a mask and a glove or a gown. And so imagine if we had a healthcare system that was not about profit, but really about providing healthcare. We would make sure all those things, we would have abundance of that. But not only here for the United States, but for around the world as well, right? There was a shipment that was coming in, a PPE, sometime in March, I believe. And the Trump administration said, no, we don't want it. It's criminal, actually. It's a criminal stupidity, but also an act of murder, actually, when you think about the things that this administration, but this system is producing in this moment of this pandemic that has affected the world, actually. The numbers are starting to come in, and its effects on in nations, nations like Brazil, for example, right, or parts of Africa. We're getting some of those parts of Eastern Europe. We're starting to see some of these numbers coming in. Even here in the United States, in the South, in the poorer areas of the country, the numbers are going up as they reopen. There's no vaccine. That can take between a year and a year and a half. There's not enough tests. Mm-hmm. Literally, states are operating by themselves, and there's no direction from the top. It's a criminal act.
Mm-hmm. I want to take you back a little bit about to the movement that was created against, around, not against, around and in support of Sanders. And I was curious to ask you what is happening with this movement, or what will happen, and also what is the proposals that you as Socialist Alternative put for the next steps of this political revolution of Sanders to be fulfilled.
Right. Well, I think the Sanders phenomenon will take multiple features. I think many of the supporters will support Biden, not with any happiness or glee. They'll do it. They will do it in a begrudging way. Many people, I think, will sit out the election as well, and I think many of them will also look for alternatives. Certainly, Trump is a danger. There's no doubt about that. But Biden represents a continuum of the Wall Street agenda. His whole career has been built off the Wall Street agenda and carrying it out. And then on top of that, you have the sexual misconduct and rape charges from Tara Reid and multiple other women, in fact. And so you have a alternative to Trump that is even as more despicable and apprehensive uh, and abhorrent as Trump. And so we're asking people, and we know lesser evilism will be a tsunami. It will not just be a stream; it will be a tsunami. People want to get Trump out of office, and we agree with that, no doubt. Trump must go, but it's how he goes. What force, what social force in society makes this administration end? And so, we are putting forward a very uh, we're putting forward a position that some people would disagree with, and we're saying no to Biden. We're not supporting Biden. We're not advocating a vote for Biden. We are advocating a protest vote, maybe for the Green Party. But even we don't see as a political alternative to the two-party system. They have their weaknesses as well. But we feel that if you do not want to support Biden, and you certainly will not vote for Trump, and you want to register your protests against the two-party system, we say vote green. But another key aspect to this, which we think is very important, is that we want to continue social movements. We want to continue to build social struggle among the working class. That means strengthening the labor movement, right? That means strengthening the climate crisis movement. That means bringing these forces together, right, into organization that will begin the process of a conversation around what a new political party would look like for the working class, the poor, and the most oppressed in the United States, to which we've never had a national party of that character that will not only run in elections every 2 or 4 years, but will be a fighting organization on a daily basis that seeks to unite the social movements, to unite working people across race, nationality, sexuality, and gender. And so we're putting forward that type of analysis. And for some people, they will reject that. We know that. But we also know that we have to plant the seeds now, that we need a new party, that we need to rebuild our institutions of struggle, like the labor movement, and that if you are going to vote, because we know the vote is very important to a lot of communities. Uh, for the Black community, it's important. Women, young people died for the right to vote. And so if you're going to vote, we would say vote green, vote the Green Party. And we will provide material to explain our reasoning for that. And we're going to highlight the differences between us and the Green Party. But we think that that's a very important step that we could take for this election period.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that with the actions, the last few years of Socialist Alternative, you have shown what a workers' party can do when it comes to power, not only take the presidency, but when it takes the power in the local level. For example, in Seattle, you have elected for the first time in decades a socialist councillor in the council elections, Sama Sarwant. She was re-elected last year, and which actually was a huge victory against Jeff Bezos, the biggest billionaire and soon-to-be trillionaire of the US. But also earlier connected also with the seat of Sama, the campaign that you did about the $15 an hour. That was Seattle was the first state to finally implement the $15 an hour, and then it went viral. So do you want to tell us a little bit about these campaigns?
Sure. I want to tie it to the fact of the pandemic, because when the pandemic hit the United States, the first state it really hit immediately was the nursing homes in Washington State, where Seattle is a major city in Washington State. And Sharma immediately made not just made statements, but made proposals on how to deal with this crisis, how to deal with this pandemic in the sense of healthcare, providing resources, hazard pay. She put forward those ideas. She put forward those plans, right? Just imagine if we had more Shama Sawants in Seattle, what the city council could do actually around the pandemic and around this crisis. But for right now, Shama is the shining star, right, around the ideas of socialism, but how to be a revolutionary in the halls of power. And so, starting from the standpoint of standing up and fighting in the interest of working people, the $15 minimum wage first passed in any major city in 2013, 6 months after her victory in the elections. We got passage of that because we built a movement, and the low paid workers went on strike and fought for that for a number of years. We come to last year's victory against Amazon. Amazon dropped $1 million in the city council race to unseat Shama. Why? Because Shama the year before had proposed Amazon tax. Basically, Seattle has a construction boom, but it has a housing issue as well. It has an affordable housing issue, and it has a homeless population that's staggering. And so proposed a bill that will tax Amazon and all the other major corporations doing business in Washington State and in Seattle, $48 million a year. To be honest with you, it was pennies of a taxation against these $1 billion generating corporations. But they were so pissed off, they were so angry that she had the audacity to propose that type of legislation, that type of bill, that type of action to deal with the crisis of homelessness, to deal with the crisis of the lack of affordability around housing, right? So they backed a candidate to go up against Shama. And unfortunately, it's a Democratic Party dominated city and a Democratic Party dominated city council. And they passed the bill, but in a matter of weeks, they reversed their decision and they basically stopped the bill from being enacted, literally in the night of day. And so Shama, upon winning again last November, has put forward another tax Amazon. And the crisis that we face is with the pandemic, social distancing, and just trying to get the campaign going, which is going great actually, with a lot of people supporting it. How we're able to get the tax Amazon on the ballot to be voted on? Because the dominated Democratic Party leadership on the city council and the mayor is stopping any further discussion around taxing Amazon. Mind you, Jeff Bezos is about to become a trillionaire. The profits of Amazon has reached during this pandemic, in the millions, if not into the billions, right? And so imagine what could be gained if a minor taxation was passed, that we could deal with the pandemic and deal with the question of housing, right? And so this campaign is going to be entering a very important phase, and that is trying to get on the ballot for November so that the people of Seattle can decide what type of taxation we need. Do we need a regressive taxation that we already have in Seattle, where none of the major corporations pay any city, state taxes, even federal taxes? They don't pay at all. And if they do, it is absolute minute of compared to their wealth. Or do we want a progressive taxation that doesn't tax the working class, but taxes the rich and their corporations? And so that's going to be the key question going forward for the movement in Seattle and for Shama Sawant and Socialist Alternative.
Mm-hmm. It's very amazing things that you're doing in Seattle, but also you had some other campaigns during the pandemic. Socialist Alternative has raised many issues. Would you like to speak a little bit about this?
Yes, we did programs called, we have a blog called Workers Speak Out, Coronavirus Lockdown, which has been absolutely fantastic. I think it's one, I've been a part of the organization for 25 years. It's one of the most significant uh, resources to have a dialogue with ordinary working people in this period of the pandemic and economic crisis. To which I think the pandemic, I mentioned the shock and awe of it. It really has torn apart not just the neoliberal model of capitalism, but also the idea of the American exceptionalism, compared that to other parts of the world that have faced pandemics of this character. Um, the level of anxiety, of depression, of alcoholism, of violence in the household has increased. The uncertainty that many working people face. And so the Workers Speak Out was a place where people could not only speak out, but speak out from the standpoint of the organizing they're doing in their workplace, in their community, to fight back and push back against the agenda of Wall Street and the two parties of big business, Democrats and Republicans. So it's been absolutely fantastic. In fact, I had a great interview with a nurse in New York City from the area of the city where I'm born and raised, Harlem, where she led a protest outside of her hospital she works in with her coworkers, talking about the conditions of nurses in the hospitals during the height of the pandemic. It's horrifying, and also the reprisal that many workers would face because they were speaking out about the realities of what was going on in the workplace. The most undemocratic place on the planet. I don't care where you're from, North or South Cyprus, Greece, South Africa, or New York. The most undemocratic place is the workplace, where you don't have the right to not only speak, but you don't have the right to democratically decide what type of products that you produce. You don't have the right to say what kind of staffing we need to properly take care of our patients. So, Workers Speak Out, I thought was a phenomenal initiative that we took. Um, but also, we've now had to move to more of a social media online type of organization because many of our comrades in different, different branches around the country have been on lockdown. And certainly as they ease restrictions, we will, go back out into the street and discuss and organize. But I think we have to be mindful of what the pandemic and social distancing, that's going to be an ongoing question. I think it's going to change the culture a little bit of the United States. Certainly, people will not listen to the social distancing and the masks, but that demands education and not policing, right?
Mhm.
It does not demand a military style approach. It demands education and conversations and an equal basis of that education. And what we have in New York and around the country and even around the world, that the state apparatus of capitalism is starting to use those methods of a militarized police to deal with the social distancing and things of that nature. And frankly, we don't need that. We need education, we need communication, and we need democracy, right? Democracy for working people. And certainly we know that the democracy of capitalism, global capitalism, can be the carrot or the stick. And a lot of times in this situation, we're going to see more and more of the stick if we don't stand up and organize and fight back.
Mhm. So my final question actually goes to this: What are the other actions and demands that you put forward in this era? Even after the lockdown, what is the first steps that you put forward for the workers, for the poor to fight for?
Right. I mean, we certainly would say we want to heighten the level of organization, meaning people should join trade unions. If you don't have a union in your workplace, definitely organize. We're seeing that already in a lot of places. It's going to be a learning lesson for a lot of young new activists that are emerging. We know also that the tenant rights movement will emerge because there's an initiative, and we're part of this initiative of Rent Strike 2020. We know that people are struggling to pay the rent on June 1st. We know that there will be big battles once, because a lot of states, a lot of cities don't have universal rent control or rent laws that really benefit tenants. And so there will be attempts to evict people and to collect back rent. And so we want to build those movements and build them stronger. We want to build the socialist movement as well. Throughout history, anytime a social movement has been at its apex, we've seen socialists be directly involved in those campaigns, in those struggles, historically and also contemporary. So we want people to be part of the socialist movement. We want people to be part of Socialist Alternative. We also want to have the conversation around what a new party will look like. What are the ingredients needed to build a party of the working class, the poor, and the most oppressed, the party of the 99%? So we want to have those discussions. We also want to do the kind of organizing that allows us to sink roots in our communities, in our workplace, in our universities. Because what's on the horizon is that capitalism is going to put this crisis, the economic crisis and the pandemic crisis, on the backs of ordinary working people, the poor and the most oppressed. And now is the time, more so than maybe any other period of time, because the pandemic, is a horrifying reality. But what capitalism has been the virus and the pandemic, but for so long and for too long. And I think what 2019 emerged for me was a powerful lesson that the working class will have setbacks, will have defeats, but the ferocity to which the working class, the poor, and the most oppressed fight, it has a vision about a new world, a world that is very much possible, but it just takes a spark to hit the streets, to hit the workplace. And 2019 for me showed, from Chile to Puerto Rico to every inch of this world, that working people want a new world. And so we firmly believe that a socialist world is not only possible, but it's needed. And this pandemic and this economic crisis opens that portal, as Aridani Roy said, opens up that portal for us to walk through. And we plan to walk through that portal, but we're not going to bring capitalism with us. We're going to leave capitalism to die the way it should die and usher a new world. And hopefully that's a socialist world and a democracy rooted in the working class, poor, and the most oppressed.
Okay, very nice. Thank you very much, Eljeer, for this interview, for being with us today. It was very inspiring what you said. I think we have many examples to take for our struggles to come in Cyprus, and hopefully many inspirational movements in the next period and political formations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My pleasure. My pleasure.
And thank you all for listening and watching. Please send us comments in the section below, not only when we are live, but when you see the video in your own time, tomorrow, the next day. Also visit our websites for more information. nedacy.wordpress.com is our website here in Cyprus of the International Socialist Alternative. You can also visit the website of the International Socialist Alternative, internationalsocialist.net. And of course, follow and visit the website of Radio Ubuntu in radioubuntu.com, on Facebook, on Instagram. Tune in next week. Tune in for music in the other shows. Take care and see you next week.
Y ahora el pueblo se alza en la lucha con voz de gigante, gritando adelante. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. La patria está forjando la unidad. De norte a sur se movilizará. Desde el salar hacia el mineral, ambos causar. Unidos en la lucha y el trabajo irán. La patria lucha